Vayne. As the turbo scaling true damage monster that she is, Vayne can be generally categorized by her incredible late game scaling and her combination of really high mobility, which makes her feel really badass and is a really cool combination for any player that both wants to have that carry potential but also really wants to feel cool while doing so. Vayne is basically the embodiment of this. And you have to embrace this because she really all-ins on this and she is balanced around her mobility. Although she has a lot of strengths in terms of being able to jump around team fights and provide a lot of damage, especially when the Vayne player is playing well, the downsides are obvious with generally weak early game with a lot of poor matchups and also a lot of compositions where she cannot slot very well or there's a lot of things that end up countering her. She's zoned off by a lot of things. She doesn't have anything fancy in terms of long range. She's a very, very old champion and it kind of shows in terms of the coolness but also simplicity of her kit relative to other champions in the game. This guide's basically supposed to be your all-in-one place to kind of get a grasp for the champion, understand her strengths and weaknesses, and what to do at each stage of the game. The best times to really slot her in are both when you can secure a matchup in which you're basically handshaking scaling or you're against an aggressive AD carry that's reliant on having good setup or is reliant on skill shots and things of that nature. That is where the mobility of Vayne shines because she is able to counter that by just dodging all of these skill shots and maneuvering around in laning phase and potentially in team fights. You also have to make sure there are none of these zoning tools that will shut her down. So things like control mages are very common that prevent her from autoing safely, and also just high damage threats that can lock down a target because Vayne really has nowhere to hide in terms of this. She can move around, but when you're faced against things like Vi or Malphite, there's not really much you're going to be able to do about it, and you're just going to be suffering a lot of the time. So these are examples of champions that you have to make sure are cleared out, and you have to see where your conditions are good. Sometimes when Vayne is strong on a patch, you're allowed to get away with this without having to worry as much, but these are natural weaknesses for the champion. So from an ability standpoint, Vayne's honestly pretty simple, and there's not that much to it. However, the mastery element and being able to understand how to use these abilities and how to pilot them is going to be the most important thing. So let's start with her passive being Night Hunter. At first, Vayne is able to gain an additional 30 movement speed when running towards enemies only. This is an excellent thing for obviously chasing because this is something that a lot of players aren't able to space around normally because the concept of the additional move speed makes a lot of players not realize that they're actually too close to Vayne until it's a little bit too late. The other element is that this passive Night Hunter is tripled in its movement speed when Vayne's ultimate is active, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. Moving on to her Q, which is Tumble, which is her bread and butter ability. So essentially, Vayne rolls in a target direction and she gains increased damage on her next auto attack. This is also an auto attack reset and allows her basically to dash in a target direction. You use this for shorter trades when you're in lane, when you're using auto and then Q and then auto again to proc your silver bolts, which we'll get to later, as well as constantly repositioning in team fights, dodging skill shots, you know the light. W is silver bolt, which is actually another passive of Vayne. And this is a 3-hit passive, arguably the original 3-hit passive, in which case each of Vayne's auto attacks applies a silver bolt onto her target. And when she applies 3 of them in a row, it procs for an extra additional true damage, and this is also a % amount of true damage. So there is really no counterplay to this ability technically, because the fact that it does % damage and true damage means that there's nothing you can really itemize against it with. This is what makes Vayne very strong and have so much carry potential, especially in the late game, because this is an insane amount of damage output, and being able to freely manipulate this on targets is going to allow Vayne to tread through any target, regardless of what they're building and who they are, right? One thing to note is that this is a unique on-hit and will only apply on one target at a time. And this is one of the only on-hits passives in the game that actually does this. So when you hit a new target, it's going to actually reset the rings on silver bolts, and that's something to keep in mind here as well. Things like Runons as well also do not proc silver bolts on the other targets. It will just keep it on the main target. Silver bolts will also apply on her abilities, and which is basically just her E, which we're going to get to, and her E being Condemn. So Condemn is basically Vayne's only peeling tool in her kit, she basically fires what looks like another auto attack, but in this case, it's a point and click ability that pushes back one target and deals physical damage, and also applies silver bolts. If that target is to hit a wall, they're actually stunned, and they end up taking double damage from this ability instead. You can also time this with flash in a direction to manipulate your position so that the direction of that the enemy goes actually changes. So if you press E on a target and then you flash to the left, then you can push them to the right. Sometimes this is very useful in lanes or in certain circumstances in which you can kite out key targets and outplay them and look really badass at the same time. Finally, onto Vayne's ultimate, which is Final Hour. So basically, Vayne just goes on steroids for the next few seconds, and she buffs up all aspects of her kit pretty much, and she gets a lot of bonuses. So it starts with bonus attack damage. It also makes her invisible when she tumbles, which is really cool. You can use it for juking, because when you're tumbling in one direction, but then you're autoing in another, you can kind of fade out your opponents and things of that nature. Your tumble cooldown is also cut in half, at least from the timing of this recording. You're going to be able to reposition much more often, and it's an excellent team fighting tool. In addition, Night Hunter's passive is tripled, like I mentioned, when you're using Final Hour. And this is a very important piece because once you're ahead, or when you manage to kind of like hit over that hump and start to win a team fight, that's when Vayne can basically lock it down and close it out. Because just when you're getting a bonus 90 movement speed when you're running towards opponents, there's basically really no getting out from that. And that's something that makes it really satisfying to play Vayne and is really rewarding when you're ahead. Because a fed Vayne is a Vayne that you can just go forward with, and going forward with gives you that bonus, and it's really, really helpful.
All right, guys, so covering your runes on Vayne, it's going to be relatively standard, but she's kind of a unique AD carry in that because her damage output is so high, she doesn't really need to worry that much about itemizing damage in her runes as much as other AD carries, right? The mindset with the runes is having enough damage to win team fights, but then dialing up your tanky stats and actually just playing the war of attrition here, right? And that's kind of the name of the game with Vayne, right? She has nowhere to hide, so a lot of the times she actually has to compensate by building more defensive stats somehow in order to survive team fights and not get absolutely blasted. And this is what a lot of Vayne pages aim to do, right? So a lot of times you're just going to be running a Lethal Temple Keystone along with Triumph as your secondary row, just because it's basically best in slot. There's not really much else you can go. In really rare circumstances where if you feel like you're just getting absolutely targeted, or you feel like you will, Overheal is like okay, but Triumph is more than likely going to have more success in a lot of your games. The third row is going to be more contingent on your laning phase and what you think you need in terms of sustainability. So Vayne doesn't really itemize that much lifesteal, at least for the most part. And if you have natural sustain in lane, let's say you have a healing enchanter support, you can afford to go Alacrity, but a lot of the times you're going to end up wanting to go Bloodline because it saves you the need to itemize lifesteal otherwise. Most of the time, since Vayne does true damage and percent damage, you're not going to need much in the way of things like cut down compared to normal AD carries. So you can either go coup de grace or last stand if you're really thinking you're going to get targeted. But if Vayne's at half health, you're just probably going to have a lot of issues anyway, at least in my opinion. So you ideally don't want to put yourself in that position, and you want coup de grace here. So like I mentioned with the attrition side, a lot of times you're going to end up going for a resolve tree just to be as tanky as possible. This works really well because Bloodline actually gives max HP, at least at this current time, with its max stacks, which is 85. Then when you go Conditioning Overgrowth, you're going to add a lot of defensive stats to your kit, right? In lanes where you're going to have a ton of poke, let's say it's Jhin Karma or Ezreal lanes with like a Xerath or Caitlyn or something like that, you can go second wind because you're going to get pelted in the early game and you want to be able to maximize your survivability. Another option instead of that, if you want sustain and you don't feel the need for whatever reason to be tanky, you can actually opt for domination and access Taste of Blood and go for something like Treasure Hunter or Eyeball Collection, things of that nature, just so you can also have sustain and your max HP or defensive stats are not as important. That's a very rare case, right? For your rune stats, it's basically going to be the same every time with attack speed, adaptive force, and armor. And that's pretty much your runes on Vayne. That's going to be your setup almost all the time, I would say. And you can pretty much rely on this. It's a really good mix of damage and sustainability.
Like in the rune section, she relies more on just having enough damage and then switching to defensive itemization options in order to make sure she lives longer, at least from the current state of Vayne. This usually involves, I'm not going to recommend any specifics, but this usually involves 1 to 2 offensive items as your core. So this could take the form, there's examples of this like Bork and Gwynsu's, which is like a very OG example. As of the timing of this video, the current combo is Static Shiv and Trinity Force, which is a really good mid-game spike option. And from there, basically once she gets her core, she's also like level 10 to level 11, and she ends up having her damage naturally be increased from getting points in Silver Bolts, which is huge, and then Tumble, which allows her to reposition and give her everything she would technically need to thrive, right? Damage is no longer an issue at that point. And from there, you end up itemizing very creatively sometimes, because when you combine it with your rune setups with bonus health and bonus resistances from conditioning overgrowth and things like that, you can afford to go things like Wit's End, Randuin's even. You can get really creative, Guardian Angel, or you can even go standard defensive items like Shield Bow or other things, right? And there's going to be a whole new slew of items as well that are going to change up this dynamic. So I recommend just keeping an eye out for the principle of being having enough damage and then building defensively to back that up. That's the idea here. Fighting on Vayne is an exercise in self-discipline and control because of just how cool the champion is and how hard it is to resist the urge to just kind of jump in, go behind enemy lines, dive priority targets, and do your thing, right? And although there are times in which your composition may call for that, if you have an aggressive comp that is focused on that and not focused on front-to-back team fighting, then go for that. Otherwise, it's more important for Vayne to live and to hit who she can, right? You have some leverage with things like Night Hunter and invisibility, but the moment you appear and you try to dive a backliner and you're in the middle of the team, you're going to be the first target they choose, right? So it's going to take some games to kind of build that knowledge of knowing your limits and testing them and then failing and then understanding what is the trigger for you to be able to actually dive these backline targets or choose your battles essentially, right? I would say to start off, you would think of Vayne as a normal front to back AD carry, but there's going to be a lot of champions that can zone her out, like I said. So that's where your adaptation of, okay, I can't play a normal team fight here comes in, and then you adapt accordingly and you say, okay, we have to play this fight differently because I can't play the fight normally, and we choose targets and things like that. So as cool and as tempting it is to be flashy, I would exercise that self-restraint and choose that point in which you can actually go for it. I would recommend watching pro team fights from Vayne players. She's not picked very commonly in pro play for this reason, but you can get some samples of pro players playing it in solo queue and just kind of learning from there and seeing what cues they look for in order to switch their targets and switch how they play. Overall, Vayne gets my highest recommendation. She's just a really cool, badass champion. She has all the things you need for success in the AD carry role for the average person, right? You have a lot of self-agency if you get ahead, right? You can 1v9 the game if you know what you're doing and you know your matchups and you know how to carry yourself to the mid game, then Vayne is a champion that's perfect for that sort of playstyle, right? You wanna bring it home for yourself, you don't wanna rely on anyone, you can totally do that. There are some games in which she has weaknesses and she can't do that at all, but it is up to the Vayne player to be cognizant of this and actually adapt their playstyle and understand what they need to do in order to find new ways to victory. And I think Vayne is a great champion for that. You can leverage your weaknesses and the depth of champion knowledge is going to be heavily rewarded with a champion with potentially so much output and carry potential, especially as a champion that has both a combination of high damage output and the ability to itemize defensively and have so much outplay potential. It is a unique mix that basically no other AD carry in the game can still offer at this time and look cool while doing it. So if that's what you're looking for, I hope this guide was useful to you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.